Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Es freut mich, dass wir offenbar eine Hürde übersprungen haben, dass wir nach 2 Jahren wieder eine Einstein Lectures Serie durchführen können. Das freut uns ganz besonders und ich nehme an, da Sie so zahlreich erschienen sind, haben Sie auch danach gelegt, dass man wieder mal was Gescheites hört. Und ich bin also ziemlich happy, dass das möglich ist und möchte nicht allzu viel Zeit wegnehmen. Ich begrüße Sie vor allem im Namen der Universität Bern und der Einstein-Gesellschaft, die diese Einstein Lectures zusammen durchführen. Und heute ist eben wie nach Fahrplan die Philosophie an der Reihe. Und heute, morgen und am Mittwoch haben wir das Vergnügen, einen wirklich kompetenten Redner zu hören, der jetzt von Herrn Stepanians fachlich eingeführt wird. Bitte.
Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich bin froh, dass Sie so zahlreich gekommen sind. Ich war etwas besorgt, nicht? Weil man weiß ja dann nicht angesichts der Covid-Situation und so weiter. Aber ja, vielen Dank, dass Sie alle gekommen sind. I will now switch into English and I will try to introduce our lecturer for tonight. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Philip Pettit was born in 1945 in a small town in the county of Galway in the west of Ireland. His early intellectual interests were in mathematics and in classics, the study of classical Greek and Latin literature. When Professor Pettit began his university studies in the 1960s, he did so with the intention of becoming a Catholic priest. But he soon fell in love with philosophy and, lucky for us, decided to become a professional philosopher. Professor Pettit received his first professorial chair in philosophy at the University of Bradford, England in 1977, and went on from there to a professorship at the Australian National University in Canberra in 1983. In 2002, he moved to Princeton University, New Jersey, and became the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Human Values. However, the Australian National University seems to have hated to see Professor Pettit go, and they managed to lure him back a couple of years later for at least half of the year by offering him another chair in philosophy. Since 2012, Professor Pettit divides his time by teaching the fall semesters in the United States and the spring semesters in Australia. Since you came here, of course, to hear Professor Pettit's talk on the genealogy of the human mind, I will not try your patience by mentioning all the awards, honors, distinguished lectureships and fellowships bestowed on him and the many prizes he won. Let me just say that they are very numerous and a glowing testimony to the excellency of his scholarship and his teaching. This introduction is also not the place to talk about the many influential books and articles Professor Pettit has written during his highly distinguished career. As of today, Professor Pettit authored or co-authored no less than 24 books, often translated into many languages, on a stunningly wide range of philosophical topics, as well as what looks like well over 100 articles and essays. Frankly, I was too lazy to count them. Instead of talking about Professor Pettit himself, I would like to provide you with a very rough sketch, painted with a broad brush stroke and a bit of poetry, of the general background and context of the problem I take Professor Pettit to be tackling in his Einstein Lectures. Quite appropriate for a lecture in honor of Albert Einstein, the problem arises from the general picture of our world that arises from modern science, especially from physics. Very coarsely put, modern science seems to have largely confirmed a worldview that Democritus formulated 2,500 years ago in these words: "In truth, there are only atoms in the void. As most of you know, of course, it was Einstein who provided the first proof of the reality of atoms while working as a patent clerk here in Bern in 1905. Philosophers such as Professor Pettit, who call themselves naturalists or physicalists, are Einstein's children. They fully accept and endorse this scientific image and its implication as a fundamental truth about our world. However, many naturalists also believe that although the image of nothing but atoms in the void must be the first word in the matter, it cannot be the last. The problem is that the world we take to be living in, that we take ourselves to be living in, our Lebenswelt or life world, as philosophers sometimes call it, seems so utterly different from a world of mere atoms in the void. First of all, our life world does not consist of just one thing, namely atoms, but of many things. In the words of one of my favorite philosophers, Lewis Carroll, "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings." No problem for the scientific image, you might say, since chemistry tells us how atoms combine into shoes and ships and sealing wax, and biology how we get from cabbages to kings. Modern science does provide a story of how we get from mere atoms in the void to cabbages and kings after all. However, it is worth emphasizing that to concede this point is already to admit that Democritus' view of merely atoms in the void is not the whole truth, and that something more is indeed needed, namely a genealogical story of how our life world emerged from mere atoms in the void. Perhaps it is this thought that led the American poet Muriel Rukeyser to insist in one of her poems, say it, the universe is made of stories, not of atoms. I would like to suggest that Professor Pettit will give us in his Einstein Lectures a part of this big story of evolution and development, perhaps the most crucial and important part. What he calls the social genealogy of the human mind is a story of how pre-human hominids developed the consciousness and the faculties of reason and moral interaction we rightly take to be characteristic of full human persons. Another important reason why some such story is needed is that it seems to be impossible for us to conceive of ourselves and our fellow human beings as mere atoms in the void, being pushed around by natural forces. I see myself as a minded person that can and does respond to reasons, and so are you. And this fact makes a momentous difference of how we deal and interact with each other. If I were ever to start treating you as merely atoms, merely bundles of atoms in the void, you should immediately get as far away from me as you can. It seems to me that Professor Pettit's endeavor to provide a social genealogy of the human mind is similar to what perhaps the greatest philosophical genealogist ever, that is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, called his Phänomenologie des Geistes, that is, his phenomenology of the spirit. When the poet Heinrich Heine studied almost 200 years ago at the University of Berlin, he attended Hegel's lectures and was shocked by what he considered to be the incomprehensible ramblings of a German philosophy professor. Heine even claims that Hegel often, and I quote, Hegel often glanced nervously over his shoulder out of fear that someone might understand him. I imagine that it must have been in one of Hegel's lectures on the phenomenology of the spirit that Heine, while his mind was drifting slowly away, jotted down the following verse in the gently mocking tone so characteristic of his poetry. I will give you first the German original. Here it is. Zu fragmentarisch ist Welt und Leben. Ich will mich zum deutschen Professor begeben. Der weiß das Leben zusammenzusetzen und er macht ein verständliches System daraus. Mit seinen Nachtmützen und Schlafrockfetzen stopft die Lücken des Weltenbaus. Now in English. Life in this world is a muddled existence. Our Irish professor will give me assistance. He knows how to whip the whole thing into order. He'll make a neat system and keep it in line. With scraps from his nightcap and dressing gown's border, he'd fill all the gaps in creation's design. Let me assure you that in stark contrast to Hegel, our Irish professor does not live in fear of being understood. In fact, I know of no other contemporary philosopher who tries so hard and so successful as Professor Pettit to be clear and comprehensible. You will find Professor Pettit's prose as enjoyable and refreshing as a glass of Swiss spring water. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to this year's distinguished Einstein lecturer, Professor Philip Pettit.
Es ist eine große Freude und eine große Ehre, hier zu sein, die Einstein Lectures zu halten. Ich bin sehr dankbar an der Universität Bern und auch an der Einstein Gesellschaft. Also, unfortunately, in English from now on, I wish es wäre wunderbar, wenn ich auf Deutsch die Vorlesung halten könnte, aber es ist zu schwierig für mich, alas. Excuse me. So to move into English, and I'm very conscious that it's always, even when you speak English as well as I know most of you do, to follow someone speaking with a native accent, even a native Irish accent, if I might say to the Irish ambassador here before me, it's quite hard to follow. So I'll speak, I hope, slightly more clearly and slowly than I might do, let's say, with an Irish or Australian or indeed American audience. I really would be grateful if someone would indicate if I'm not audible or intelligible, maybe by doing that sort of sign. Please feel free to do that, and I'll be on the lookout. Okay, so the idea of these lectures that I'm presenting here is to follow up on something I've been pursuing for some time, and I hope will constitute a book in a year or so from now, which is the idea that really culture has done more than we allow in constituting human beings. Now, by all accounts, nature supplies one part of what makes us human, of course, but culture supplies another. But the difference is really between different, well, I suppose, naturalistic theories, to use Professor Stepanians' phrase, is that they vary on how important nature's contribution is and how important culture's contribution is. Now, I'm going to argue for a more or less, I suppose, radical or extreme hypothesis in arguing that I think culture really plays an even deeper role than that has been fully documented or supported at least in the literature that I know. The hypothesis I call a hypothesis of an outside-in mind. The contrast there is with the view that we often associate with Descartes, which is that, the mind, the res cogitans, is lurking inside, and we produce speech and we do the various social things by way of direction from this headquarters of the mind, as you might call it, located, as he thought, at the pineal gland, deep in the head. I call that an inside-out theory of the mind, meaning that the action is mainly on the inside, and that what appears on the outside, speech and social activity and engagement, is really just a sign directed from the inside. I actually think that we are deeply social beings, of course by nature, and that it's in virtue of what we learn in being raised, from when we're infants through adolescence to adulthood, that we really achieve, we grow into humanity, and that it's really culture plays a very deep role. I call that an outside-in theory of the mind, the idea being that in our individual development, but also, and this is a bold claim on my part, in the evolution of our species, it was the development of cultural habits, in particular habits associated with the use of language, with dialogue or conversation, if you like. It was those social skills and the mastery of those social skills that came in a way first. Of course, there was a lot presupposed in human nature to even developing those skills, but it was the mastery of those skills that then fed back into our mental skills, our mental capacities, and in particular those mental capacities that really mark us off most sharply from other species, including the other primates, the giant apes, for example. I'm going to try to argue that in these lectures. I'm a philosopher, so how does a philosopher argue for that sort of thesis? Well, in a way, taking a leaf out of Albert Einstein's book, if I can be bold enough to claim any connection. Although, mind you, he lived in Princeton, just about 100 yards from where I currently live. It'd be nice to think that some of the aura spread and got absorbed. But in the spirit of Albert Einstein, who favored the Gedanken experiment, the thought experiment. I mean, it's deep there at the foundation of special relativity. Remember when you were asked to imagine a train moving away from you at nearly the speed of light, certainly a very fast train, and then you assume that the speed of light is constant, as had been more or less established empirically, what would happen? And then he forces you to think that if there was a clock on that train moving away with light at constant speed, then it would be going more slowly in your perception. And that means, and here he was borrowing from the philosopher Ernst Mach, I think, that means in his terminology that time is traveling. Our time is slowing down, as we might put it. That's a Gedanken experiment. Again, his general relativity is based on the thought experiment of being in an elevator, so to speak, taking off and asking you to ask yourself, would you be able to distinguish between accelerating upwards and feeling gravity pulling you down? And the thought experiment suggests no, and in a way, much of the theory and of the ground mathematics built around that was developed from that thought experiment. Now, I'm not going to do anything as exciting as providing a theory of special or general relativity, but I am going to use the thought experiment method. I'm going to invite you in a way to join me in conducting a thought experiment that I think may shed light, I don't say necessarily does, may shed light on exactly the contribution of culture and may help to support the hypothesis that I've sketched of social skills and mental skills, so to speak, co-developing, so that it's only in virtue of the social skills being learned that we learn the corresponding mental capacities, rather than on the inside-out view, whereby the mental capacities come first, perhaps from nature, and then are expressed in the social practices or activities. The sort of thought experiment I'm going to run is one that will be familiar, for example, from basic economics. So let me just remind you what economists do when they're asked, what is money? And it's sort of a puzzling question. What is money? How do you define money? How do you understand it? What's its role? What's its nature? And economists, for now well over 100 years, going in the work, but his name escapes me just now, of a German, I believe, economist, all say, well, imagine a society, counterfactual society, not a historical society, but imagine a society with creatures just like us who want to exchange with one another because they want something somebody else has and somebody else wants something they have, and they want to trade for their mutual benefit or advantage. And then the economist points out, look, in that world where there was no money, we're starting from a world where there's no money, but where people do want to exchange or barter. And then they point out, in that world there would be terrible problems, because maybe I raise puppies for a livelihood, but I really want a table. But the person who makes tables in the community, or whatever it might be, has more puppies, doesn't want puppies, so I can't exchange with that person. So I've got to find someone who both makes tables or can provide tables and wants puppies. And that's going to be a really big search problem, isn't it? And what the economists argue then is that in that counterfactual scenario, what they say, I think plausibly, would almost certainly happen, would be robustly likely to happen, would be likely, regardless of contingencies, to happen, is that sooner or later it would be clear to everyone that there was one commodity around that almost everyone, or at least a lot of people, really wanted, so that if only you could get a hold of that commodity, you could use it to trade for things that you wanted that other people produced. Think of Berlin in 1945, 46, 47, when it was clear to everyone actual paper money, German paper money, had really gone to nothing, but it was clear to everyone that everyone seemed to want to smoke. And so everyone, even people who did not themselves want to smoke, looked for cigarettes, because they knew if they could get cigarettes, they could trade them for almost anything else. Everyone, even if they didn't want cigarettes, knew someone who wanted cigarettes, and everyone wanted to build up their cache of cigarettes. And of course, the economists will then argue that's going to happen in almost any bartering society. The one commodity becomes prominent as a commodity almost everyone wants, and it then will be sought for its exchange value, for its potential in exchanging with others, and it will assume, and then they tell you, that's really what money is. It's a commodity of that kind which may or may not be useful in itself, like gold, for example, or cattle, as it used to be, including in an Irish tradition and indeed African traditions. Cattle served as this medium of exchange. And they say, that's what money is. And suddenly you say, okay, right, I see. It's a commodity serving that function, whatever the commodity is. And of course, it can then be swapped for paper IOUs that say, you'll get some of that commodity from me if you present this piece of paper, and then those pieces of paper get used. Anyhow, most of you will be familiar with that story. I want to tell that sort of thought experiment, or invite you to join me in thinking about that thought experiment. I want to take you back to a society, to imaginary society. Think of it as another world, if you like, or think of it perhaps as this world in the long distant past, perhaps 100,000 years ago or whatever. And I want you to imagine creatures exactly like us, but who haven't yet come to language. And then I want you to think about what difference language, converse, exchanging signs with one another as to how things are, what difference that would make to the mental capacities of these creatures. And I want to suggest that actually, as you think about that sort of experiment, it becomes very vivid that it could be quite transformative, the effect of words, so to speak, on thoughts, the effect of language on mind, the effect of the social skill of learning to exchange signs in converse or dialogue, on the mental skills that we have. Okay, that's the project. So these creatures that I'm asking you to imagine with me, let's call them humanoids. That's not hominids or hominins, which are words from evolutionary theory. Humanoid, as in human, and oid meaning like humans. So these humanoids are now imaginary creatures, and I'm going to ask you to conduct that thought experiment with me on them. But before going through the experiment, we need to think a little bit about the scenario and these sorts of creatures and what capacities we could reasonably ascribe to them, assuming they don't yet have language. Well, and if you have the handout, I'm moving now into the second section that says the setting of the thought experiment. first thing we've got to assume about the humanoids, of course, is that they're animals, as we are animals, that pursue purposes or goals, and pursue these goals across very different scenarios. So in each scenario, their pursuit of the goal is directed by what they think about that scenario, what they believe the scenario to be. If you're pursuing a particular goal in one scenario, you take a different behavior from what you do in another scenario, where a different sort of behavior will be appropriate. So they're intentional agents, if you wish, and all agents have this characteristic, that pursue goals according to the representations of the scenario in which, or the situation in which they are operating. That's a basic sort of thing, and that means that the humanoids are simply agents, intentional agents. And they do this intelligently, in the sense that if a particular means they adopt on the basis of a certain belief about what's necessary doesn't lead to the fulfillment of the goal or the purpose, they will often search around for another means, that's intelligence, flexible intelligence, and choose another means or test another means until, if possible, they find one that will actually deliver the behavior that will realize that goal. That's the basic assumption. But there are more assumptions we can make about them and should make about them that make them like us in particular, rather than just like any agent in general. So one is that, like us, they sort of, if you want to put it this way, can read one another's minds. Now we know from animal studies, ethology, that there are many animals that appear to be able to pick up basically what another fellow creature, a conspecific, is making of a certain situation. They don't expect the conspecific to act, so to speak, just on the belief that the situation is as they believe it to be. They recognize that that agent, say, can't see what they can see. They allow for that, and they expect behavior that reflects that mind's view of what there is, rather than what there is as they themselves can see it. Let's call that mind reading. It's much written about by psychologists, philosophers too, and ethologists. And I assume that these creatures are attuned to one another in this way from infancy, so that like primates certainly can do this, that don't have language, they have that sort of sense of one another and an ability to predict what the other will do, allowing for the fact that the other may be mistaken about how things actually are, mistaken from their own point of view. They can take the perspective, as it were, of the other to that extent and predict what the other will do, given that way of seeing things. Another characteristic that I think we should ascribe to them, which I think is found in many other animal species, though that I must say is a subject of some debate in the scientific literature, which is that these creatures do things together, meaning that they have got goals not just of their own that they pursue intelligently as intentional goals, but they also have goals that they share, and they're able to adjust to one another according to, as it were, an assumed plan in order to realize that goal together. So they each intend to play their part in an overall joint goal. Many of you will be familiar with this aspect of human beings as it apparently emerged in our early history from the work of various ethologists and psychologists, for example. And the argument is that probably between 400,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago, human beings, our forebears, were in a scenario where they really had to hunt and forage for food together and help one another to raise babies and to keep safe from danger and so on. And if they didn't do that, if they didn't learn in that way to act together for their various goals, they would not survive. It was a period of obligate cooperation, as it's sometimes described. Basically, they survived together or they died alone, and natural selection led them to become a species, communities, that actually were able to act together in that way. They have joint action, capacities for joint action. I think we can ascribe that equally to our humanoids, because it doesn't presuppose language by almost all accounts. There are at least varieties of joint action that do not presuppose a mastery of language. A third capacity that makes them resemble us, that I think we should ascribe to them, is a capacity that an Australian colleague of mine, Kim Sterelny, describes as apprentice learning. Now, really, worldwide, there are a lot of people who've been pushing this idea about early human beings, that we were fairly distinctive as a species in teaching our young to do things, in teaching them in particular as apprentices traditionally were taught. By doing things, the adults would do things in a way that made clear to the young, to the apprentice, how exactly to do it, to achieve that end, and so on. There have been various arguments based on the production of stone tools and the development of more and more complex means of trade and so on, that argue that our species from very early on had this capacity for apprentice learning. Now, other animals don't seem to do this, even the higher primates. They copy one another, for sure. The young copy the older, so to speak. But the older don't do anything, don't go out of their way to enable the young to learn it. That is something that seems to be specific to our species. It's not language dependent, and I think for that reason we can think that the humanoids also have this capacity. The final capacity we, I think, can assume in them is a capacity, and I'll have to explain this a little bit more, the capacity to communicate. Now, I accept an account of communication that philosophers and linguists will associate with the work in particular of Paul Grice in the 50s and 60s. And just to give an idea of what I mean, let me say that I think by recent work that chimps, for example, among the great apes, can actually communicate in the sense I'm going to explain. Let me just tell you what the chimps do, because that's the best way of explaining what I mean by communication here. There have been quite a few studies over the last couple of decades especially of how far chimps are altruistic with one another, how far they help one another. These are often called targeted help studies. So one study goes like this. You've got a chimp in one particular enclosure here on the right, another chimp in an enclosure on the left, and neither can get over the barrier in between. Think of it as this desk if you wish. The chimp on the right-hand side, if only it had, a long stick, would be able to reach a reward of some kind, say a banana, which you can see. It's got some sticks in its enclosure, but none of them will reach the damn banana. But then it sees that in the other chimp's enclosure, there are sticks, or at least a stick, with which they could reach the banana. And so in descriptions of this scenario, what happens is the following. The first chimp here, righty, as it were, my right, attracts the attention of lefty, the chimp over there, by making noises or whatever. And then he stretches towards the long stick as if to reach it and pick it up. But it's obviously manifest to him, to her, to it, and to the other chimp that it can't actually reach that stick. But then it's clear what's happening is the chimp, by attracting the attention of lefty and trying to reach for the stick that it wants, is aiming to get lefty to understand that it wants that big stick. That's its goal. With that, he can then get the banana. And it turns out that lefty, in most cases, like 90%, I think, some high percentage, on seeing what righty wants, will actually give it to him. So righty is seeking a response from the other chimp by showing the other chimp what response he's seeking. You know, we sometimes say, thinking can't make it so. But actually in this sort of episode, interaction, it's just getting the other chimp to see, in that sense to believe, to think that it wants that long stick, that will make it so that it gets the stick because the other will respond. Now that's really communication. Communication is, in this basic sense, a form of instrumental action. You're seeking a goal, like righty is seeking the goal of getting that stick. You don't yourself have the means of achieving that goal, but if you get another chimp to recognize what goal you're seeking, it can actually realize the goal for you. That's what it is to communicate. Like when you want the salt at table, and you say to someone, is the salt there? Could I have the salt? Or point at the salt. What you're making clear is that you have a goal of presumably salting your food or whatever. You have a means, which is to get the salt. You can't reach it. You just make clear to the other what you want. And hey presto, the other delivers it. That's communication, whereby you rely on achieving a goal just by making it clear to the person, the other specific in question, what goal it is you're seeking, and letting them, as it were, do the work required for you to achieve that goal. So you get them to realize that you want the salt and thereby to give you the salt. That's all I mean by communication. And in that sense, we've got to assume that these humanoids can communicate too. They have at least the general character of these chimps I'm describing. We've got to assume just one thing more in order to start the experiment, the thought experiment. This is the very last thing. Then we're right into the experiment, the stages, so to speak, of the thought experiment, which I'll try to take you through. The last thing is this, that they learn signs, vocal signs in particular, paradigmatically, though not necessarily vocal. They learn signs and are able, by means of signs of this kind, to reveal to one another what it is they want in various cases, and thereby to achieve what they want. The chimp, after all, is very limited to gestures like stretching, for the stick. And the language of gesture is, well, there are some who write about how really dense and wonderful it is, but it's pretty crude, it seems to me, by any metric. It's very limited. But imagine they have vocal signs that can be used by them to communicate responses that they're seeking. That will make a big difference. Now, it's not magic when I say imagine they have signs, because there are lots of animals that have signs too. So, for example, in some wonderful studies by Seifert and Cheney on vervet monkeys in Kenya, in a part of Kenya, they discovered the following. And something similar is true of vervet monkeys elsewhere in Africa too. The vervet monkeys, it turns out, have vocal signs, calls, if you like. But the calls they have, they're rather fixed in their nature. But the calls are like these. If an eagle appears in the sky, that's dangerous for a monkey. Any vervet that sees that eagle is likely to make a particular sort of call. They seem to do it or not do it fairly routinely, but not invariably. It's not as if it's just a reflex. But when they call out with the call that signals eagle, all of the other vervets, depending where they are going to move to a position that will give them protection against an eagle. In other words, they're going to behave as if they themselves saw the eagle. The sign is going to stand in for the situation they don't themselves observe, but they might have observed. The vervet monkeys have another call for a leopard. And of course, different action is required. You go right up the top of the tree with the leopard, apparently, to be protected against the leopard. That's exactly not what you do with an eagle. You stay middle of the tree where the eagle can't get at you. There's a further call for a snake. And again, there are different ways of responding to snakes, depending on where you are. One in long grass is not going to stay in long grass if another vervet has made the call for a snake. Now, what I ask you to imagine with these humanoids is that they have developed, think of them, if you like, as Russo might have thought of them as grunts, vocal calls that are more conventional or arbitrary as calls than the calls of the vervet monkeys, which seem to be hardwired into their nature. And having calls of that kind may, in the history of our species, be associated with the fact that we're a musical species. I mean, lots of natural historians now play with that idea that the capacity to make so many different sounds that we can have and to discriminate so many different sounds, the fact that we can chop up those noises and hear them as distinct sounds, and vary in loudness, vary in pitch, vary in emphasis, and hear, so to speak, those as different calls, that would have given the humanoids, that's what I'm going to imagine with the humanoids, a very rich repertoire with which to communicate. And so now, into the thought experiment. I'm sure you're breathless, don't speak with excitement, but here goes. I'm sorry, philosophy is always rather arid and, punching it out point by point. I wish I had more stories to tell you, about vervets and chimps and so on. That adds a bit of color. There won't be many stories, alas, in what follows, but I hope it will be, to my mind, it's a fairly clear narrative. And it's what I call, it's a counterfactual genealogy. It's a counterfactual narrative about how things might develop with these humanoids as a result of gaining access to signs of the kind I've imagined with the capacities they have. And it's parallel to the economist story about what do we expect of human beings who barter with the want of money that might lead them in the end to develop money. I'm going to argue that these humanoids would be led in the end to develop novel capacities. In this first go at the thought experiment, I'm going to focus on just one capacity that is very distinctive of us, and I'm going to suggest that these humanoids, though they need not have had that capacity to begin with, would naturally develop it as a result of entering the space of language. Okay, so I think I have, 5 stages in my thought experiment, so if you'll bear with me, let's go to the first. The first is gaining information, the second is norms governing the giving of information, and the third is gathering information. 3 G's. Okay, on the gaining of information, well, here's one thing very interesting, it seems to be, which is, suppose you've got a humanoid that sees, for example, a tiger, which would be natural predator from the point of view of any human-like, therefore any humanoid creature, and imagine that it has a call, perhaps differing from society to society, from culture to culture, not a native call like with the vervets, but it's kind of noise that in this community people generally accept stands for tiger. And suppose the humanoid seeing the tiger makes this call that answers to that word, whatever the call might be, whatever the word might be. Okay, so what's going to happen is that it has formed a belief that there's a tiger there. That's to say, it's become disposed to behave as if there were a tiger there. That's what a belief is. It disposes it to seek shelter or to hide or whatever it might be. But by uttering this noise, this signal, as contemporaneously with forming that belief, it of course enables conspecifics, other humanoids in its community who hear that noise, to gain information, to learn, like the vervet monkeys learn from one another, gee, there's a tiger there, and themselves to behave as is appropriate if there's a tiger in the neighborhood. Themselves to form the belief that there's a tiger in the neighborhood, becoming disposed to act as if that were the case and to seek refuge of whatever kind. So notice what's happening here is that insofar as these vocal calls have come in to serve a purpose, to come into existence, they're serving an immediate purpose of enabling any one individual to enable other individuals to gain information. So they're going to gain information from one another and from these calls. They don't have to see the tiger themselves. Or it might be food of some kind, it might be prey rather than predator. They again can share that information, gaining it from one another, as far as they each have these vocal, audible signs in which to communicate, so to speak, that there is a tiger there. You can imagine the humanoid who calls out tiger as seeking, maybe not necessarily initially, but you can imagine learning that when you do that, you achieve a certain goal, which is getting others to join you in hiding or maybe attacking the predator, defending against the predator. And of course, you intend to achieve that goal by getting others to recognize what goal it is you're achieving. So they communicate in signs like that, and they each gain information from one another. Of course, on some occasions, you can imagine, I'm a humanoid, I've found a cache of food of some kind, great information to have. It means I'm not going to go hungry for 2 or 3 days. There's that great cache of food. I may not want to share that information because, of course, that creates competition for the food. It won't last that long if others are seeking it too. And so there is a temptation always for them to pretend or to refuse to give information or to give false information. But notice they're quickly going to learn, and this, by the way, is a pattern present in many other species too, that if you don't play ball with others, they're not going to play ball with you. That if you deceive others or refuse to give information when you obviously have it, they're going to refuse to give information to you, or they're going to mislead you. It's a game of tit for tat, and tit for tat is a widely established pattern of reciprocity present in a whole range of species. So we can assume that these humanoids are going to have learned that while they can enable others to gain information that only they have, they'd better be reliable in giving information, or else others won't be reliable when they seek information from others. That's really the first stage of the experiment. Now, the second really elaborates on that first stage by saying that this means that they're going to develop a habit amongst themselves of being careful to be reliable signalers, be reliable informants of one another. Because if it becomes clear to, say to Marcus, my immediate host, that I'm somebody who isn't reliable, say because I'm careless, he asks me a question, seeks information from me. Got to think of us as humanoids now in a rather simple environment. If he seeks information from me, that I can often be careless about seeing if that is the case before saying that it is or not. Or I can be untruthful, even when I know what really is the case. If I'm careful enough to know it, I can be untruthful in communicating. Now it's pretty clear, it's going to be clear among the humanoids, that unless they play ball, in the sense of being both careful and truthful, in their, let's call them by their name now, assertions, in their reporting, their signing about the environment around them, then they're going to suffer in the longer term. The people whom they let down, with whom they prove careless or untruthful, are going to let them down. And this being true of every pair, it's going to rapidly become a pattern in the community. That in general, temptation is not being overwhelming, so to speak. They're going to develop a pattern of truth-telling amongst themselves, so that each is going to expect of others that they will give me information when I seek it. I want to know, prey? Is there prey around, somewhere? I'm hungry. This other individual has information, that they will give that information to me, carefully form the belief, and truthfully respond to my query. In that way, realize my goal of wanting to know where there is food by recognizing what goal I'm seeking, and thereby acting so as to enable me to achieve that goal, in this case by giving me information about where there is food. But not only will they expect of one another, as a matter of fact, that in general, gee, unless the guy is an idiot, so to speak, people are going to be truth tellers, serious, careful truth tellers. But what's also going to be the case, and is going to be clear to them, is that anyone who fails to live up to that standard of careful, truthful reporting or assertion is going to be ostracized, ignored, or maybe even punished in other ways. So that's to say that not only will they have expectations of one another, they will hold one another, as we say, to those expectations. Each will recognize that unless I meet the expectations of others in speaking carefully and truthfully, I'm going to suffer, whether by ostracism or deception on the part of the other, or whatever. So that means there's going to be a rule or a set of norms established amongst them that they're all going to recognize, and they're going to teach their young, presumably, that unless you play ball in this way, unless you sign carefully and truthfully to one another, you're on the outer. And your reputation is going to depend on that, in the sense that not only will the people you let you down, information that you've let them down will spread. We could talk about reasons why it'll spread, but I'm going to take that as granted for the moment. And once it's spread, of course, your name in the community becomes dirt, so to speak. So nobody wants to play ball with you because you're known to be someone who cheats. Okay, so those are the norms that are going to develop of information exchange, whereby we gain information from one another. Okay, so now that means, of course, that when someone signs that something is the case to another individual, they'd better be careful in making sure that it is the case, and they're very careful of using the appropriate signs for what they believe to be the case. They'd better be truthful too. And that means that when they do that, they are running a check on their own beliefs, on the beliefs they're forming, or maybe beliefs that they always held but weren't really articulate, as we say, hadn't been brought to words. So in a way, they're going to ratify, not just indicate what they believe in answering the question, but they're going to ratify it, as in they're saying to the other person, you can rely on this being the case. You can rely on my belief as I'm communicating it to you, being carefully and truthfully shared with you. Okay, now third stage follows quickly. This means that when I give information, when any one of us gives information to another, what are we forced to do? Someone asked me, Marcus asked me about prey or predators or dangers or the weather, or what I think about what the weather is like on the other side of the hill, whether the fruit is ripening on the hill or whatever. I realize that to answer such a question, especially if I'm going to keep my reputation within the community as a reliable signer, a reliable speaker, I've got to make an intentional effort to either try to recall, now was the fruit when I walked by it, was it actually ripe? And that's really an intentional effort. I'm trying hard to recall. And I say, yes, and I say, yes, it was, and then I communicate. Or let's say, I can see something he can't. Maybe he's older and has lost his eyesight to a good extent, or at least his eyesight is less sharp. I'm young, and he says, are they, say, another group of humanoids? Are they our lot? Are they friends? Or are they from the other tribe, maybe enemies? And I'm going to look closely, and I'm going to make an intentional effort to pay attention to exactly what they're wearing, the way they walk, the way they wear their hair, if that's different in communities. And on the basis of taking care, I can then carefully and truthfully communicate. But that means that I may not have been clear in my own mind. I may not already have had a belief, or at least not a very sharpened belief, about whether they are friend or enemy in the distance. But of course, by being forced to answer that person's questions, by making an intentional effort to gather information, to make the evidence, the data, so to speak, clear in my mind, I can actually improve my own beliefs, can't I? Because where I didn't have a belief at all, I may now form a belief in trying to answer their question. Or if I had an older belief, sort of more or less not at the forefront of my mind, by thinking about it, yes, I can sharpen that belief and I can reconfirm it as a belief. So it's going to be clear to each of us that, there's something in it for those of us who even give information. There may be a free writing temptation of the kind I spoke of, but there's a lot to be gained, by being involved in this game. And, take other examples. Someone asked me, I've got a cold. Were there colds in the ancestral times? I think there were. I think it's an old virus. Asked me to smell something. Is this vinegary? Is it sweet or is it not? And I smell, and again, I make an intentional effort. I do research and I do reflection, R and R, so to speak, in order to make sure that my signing to the other person is going to keep my reputation for being a reliable interlocutor, and a reliable speaker, alive and well. And the same goes for tasting or touching. Is that, an animal or is it a plant, that someone can see from a distance and I'm beside it and I touch it to see, oh, it's a dead animal, or, oh, it's one of those mossy type plants. Okay, so you can see that by becoming givers of information to others, we actually gather information ourselves and we can improve our own beliefs. Now that takes me to the fourth stage, we are relieved to know, the second last stage in this thought experiment, which is that, the humanoids are going to become aware that, this isn't a mut's game or anything, giving information to others. It doesn't always, as it were, put you at a disadvantage by letting them know what you know. Actually, by playing that game, you come to know a lot of things you maybe didn't know previously. You sharpen up your own beliefs. You form new beliefs that you didn't have previously. It's a win-win, you might say. But now, of course, having recognized that, and being creatures who answer questions, and of course ask questions, seek information by whatever linguistic means, maybe it's tiger, with an interrogative curl at the end. That's a way of seeking information. Is that a tiger in the distance? Because we can both ask questions and answer questions in converse with one another as humanoids, it's going to be clear to us that, hey, we can do this on our own as well. I don't have to rely on somebody else to ask me questions in order to make the intentional effort necessary in order to sharpen up and expand my beliefs. I can ask myself questions. I can play interlocutor to myself. I can put myself in the shoes of another and say, now, wait a moment, was that fruit ripe on the hill when I came by this morning? Because I want to know what I'm going to do in the afternoon. And I try to recall, because that's the data relevant, the evidence relevant, and I can sum it and then say, yes, it was ripe, Or I can ask myself, is this drink potable or not? And I sniff it, and I try to remember smells of things that made me sick and things that didn't. And I think, no, it's not. For example, not a healthy drink or whatever, it's something worrying about it. I can ask myself, I can interiorize or internalize the social activity of answering and asking questions by asking myself questions, by making the intentional effort required in order to answer those questions, and thereby, by my own intentional efforts, I can expand or secure the beliefs that I have. And of course, this is going to be a very attractive thing now, because it's really important for me as a humanoid, as it's important for us as human beings, to have a range of informed beliefs across a whole swathe of topics or questions which are likely to be relevant in how I fare in my society, my external environment. And so it's going to be attractive for me to, in that sense, ask myself questions, try to answer them, make the intentional efforts to beef up my own body, my own informational base, to give myself, as you might call it, informational capital, a sort of saving in knowledge that can help me. Of course, I can learn from other people, as we've seen, but now it's true that I can do this all on my own. I can perform a novel sort of mental activity. Now notice, there's no evidence that any of the primates do this, for example. But the humanoids, I think, would invariably come to have this mental capacity to make an intentional effort at R&R, at seeking out evidence relevant to questions that are important for them, reflecting on that evidence in the sense of exposing themselves to it, and then seeing where it leads them. And by this means, increasing their own information. Fifth stage, what do we call this new mental activity? Well, it's very hard to call it anything other than, hey, they've got a capacity to make up their own minds about what to believe, about what they ought to believe. They've got this extraordinary capacity now to interrogate, so to speak, their evidence and to build up their own beliefs, to update their own beliefs appropriately, and to keep that body of belief updated continuously and nicely shaped. Now, of course, all animals, and we too, update our beliefs, and all animals, and we most of the time, the same is going to be true of these humanoids, update our beliefs sub-personally. We don't have to make an effort. And I perhaps haven't made an effort, but I will have learned that the light has faded, for example, without adverting to it. My beliefs will update more or less automatically, subpersonally or subconsciously, as it were. And thank goodness for that. Most of our beliefs do update all of the time without thinking about it. But the thing about us, as distinct from other animals, even primates, and the thing now about the humanoids as I'm describing them, is that they wouldn't just be at the mercy of the world making up their minds for them in that subpersonal, uncontrolled way, but they can make these intentional efforts to make sure that their minds are updating properly, to secure themselves in the assurance that what they believe to be the case really is the case, and that they have beliefs on all of the matters that are really important to them, where the evidence is available. This activity of making up your own mind about what to believe is like thinking, or it's like making a judgment. I don't think that primates make judgments in that sense, or think in that sense. What the humanoids are doing is actually a faint adumbration or foreshadowing of what we all imagine Rodin's Le Penseur is doing when you remember Le Penseur, is there deeply in thought, working out maybe the proof of Pythagoras' theorem, eyes shut, thinking over. Le Penseur is obviously doing this activity, which I think is a materialization of a social activity, of asking himself questions and of seeking answers in the hope that the answers will come as he researches in his mind, memory perhaps, the relevant data, and allows himself to be exposed to that data, to reflect on it in that sense. That's what I think the social skill of converse will in the first place enable these humanoids to achieve. It's the capacity for judgment or for thought, if you like, for active thought. And it's really one of the most distinctive things about human beings. Let me go back at this stage to the hypothesis. The hypothesis was that culture delivers a lot. Nature delivers a lot too, of course. But that culture delivers maybe more than you might have thought. Now, you might well have thought, I think most people have thought, certainly someone like Descartes thought it in trumps, so to speak, that actually nature delivered the whole thing, holus bolus, and that, culture is like just releasing capacities that are internal to us. On this picture in the phylogeny of our species, if you take the humanoids to be a good model of us, and you may not do that, but if you do that, then what happens amongst the humanoids suggests something about thinking amongst us, that it is the interiorization of a social skill. Let me for a moment go back to the economic experiment, the thought experiment, and ask you to think about what it achieves for the economist. Well, it tells the economist, I see, that would be money. Yes, I'd call that money. Now, if he accepts that, or she accepts that as a model of our actual world, this counterfactual world of bartering that develops the favorite commodity, then they are going to conclude that the function of money is to provide a medium of exchange, and of course associate with that a means of storing up wealth. You can get a lot of cigarettes. Lots of people did in Berlin in 1946, hoarded them. And of course you can also get a metric of price, like a beer is worth so many cigarettes, and so on through various other services. Not only did the story serve for the economist to reveal the function, but also it was the nature of money, which is, it doesn't matter what the commodity is, be it cattle, or be it cigarettes, or be it gold, or be it some paper token of those things, so long as it serves this purpose of enabling exchange. It's a functional kind. And it tells you something about the origin, function, nature, origin. It tells you something about the origin of money too. It tells you that, it didn't have to be invented, that if money hadn't been invented, if it hadn't been invented, it would have appeared anyhow, that it doesn't depend for its origin on the ingenuity of individual human beings and having this great idea, let's invent money, let's call it such and such. It would have grown spontaneously. Now similarly, our little thought experiment, if you take the humanoids to be an appropriate model of us, tells us something about the function of thinking, which is to enable us to build up information in the way in which we would in seeking to answer the questions of others. We answer our own question. It tells you about the nature of thinking or making judgments in that sense, which is to say that it's any activity. Maybe it's trying to recall carefully, maybe it's trying to look more carefully, maybe it's dwelling on whatever it is you are seeing or you recall, but any such activity that serves the function of enabling you to either expand or secure your belief base, your informational base, counts as thinking. But most importantly of all, from our point of view, I think it tells or suggests a lesson about the origin of the capacity to think in that way. It suggests that, it may have come about, as by our counterfactual story, it would have come about amongst the humanoids, by virtue of a social skill developing once language becomes available, and that skill being internalized or interiorized in an exercise of asking oneself questions and performing those intentional actions of attention or whatever that will be needed to answer the questions of others in seeking to answer your own questions. It suggests that the origin may, in that sense, be deeply cultural, that it need not have pre-existed language at all, that prior to language we may be as other highly intelligent primates are. And we know the DNA difference is tiny between us and the great apes, but that this little magic moment, this happy accident, may have been the transformative event that enabled us to become thinkers, so to speak, and not just believers. Of course, the activity I'm talking about is a wonderful activity. It's the activity of assuming a certain autonomy or control over your own mind, You cease to be a slave, so to speak, of the pressures to believe this or that upon you, and you become capable of taking charge, at least in part. Of course, you always depend on the subpersonal processing as an infrastructure, but at least in part, at certain areas, you can hone and develop the skill in order to take charge of your own informational development, your own expansion of belief. And the story I've told, I believe, and I've argued elsewhere, and the book will have that argument, that a similar story can be told about not just the formation of our beliefs, but our decisions about what to do as distinct from what to believe, or about what to seek or desire as distinct from what to do or what to believe. And if this is true, if language could have precipitated, initiated, released this extraordinary capacity, then what it has enabled us to do, what it would enable the humanoids to do, is to fulfill an aspiration that is best expressed by that wonderful mantra of Freud's, where he says, "Wo es war, soll ich werden." Where there was impersonal control, or subpersonal control, where it was all bubbling up depending on how the little grey cells were interacting or whatever, and I just had to wait and hope they delivered, so to speak, appropriate beliefs. I can put in place of that es, that it, that impersonal something, I can put myself, the person, ich. I can take charge. And that is, I think, a very deeply important aspect of human autonomy, this autonomy in thought. Now, this is the first of 3 lectures, and let me just mention that the other 2 will continue to defend the hypothesis that basically our minds get formed outside in by the interiorization of social skills, rather than being already existed on the inside and just being expressed in social practice and skills. I'm going to try to develop that not just with judgment or thinking, as I have today, but what I call reasoning, and I'm going to look at its effects, transformative effect on our consciousness, as we call it, in the second lecture. And in the third, I'm going to look at another distinctive human capacity, and of course reasoning is equally distinctive, and our sort of consciousness, I say, is distinctive. I'm going to look at another capacity that is also distinctive as human beings, which is the capacity to ascribe and assume responsibility, holding ourselves and one another to account for what we do. Now, we do, of course, get irritated with the dog when the dog soils the carpet, and we try to train the dog, and we may even, if we're inhumane enough, slap the dog or whatever, and hope it learns the lesson, as we say. But we're not holding it responsible in the way in which we're holding someone responsible when we say to the person, or we say to ourselves, "You could have done otherwise. I could have done otherwise. I could have told the truth and I didn't. I blame myself." That's going to be the third theme, the connection with responsibility and actually being a person, as I think of it. But I should stop now. Thank you very much.